So I'm going to talk today about an evolutionary approach to predicting technological progress and economic growth. I'm going to just give you a few snippets. Let me just, I didn't get the right version of the slides, but this work is actually supported by Ralph Dumm's through a grant called GrowthCom that Luciano and I are in, and by the DOE, and by GrowthCom supported by Ralph Dumm under FP7, or the European Commission, I should say. Now, can I get this to move the slides? Technology is something I think we underestimate its importance and how much it's integrated into our lives. It's been around with us for a long time. I like this guy from Norway in ancient times. One can argue whether did we get smart and then we created tools, or did we get smart because we started to use primitive tools, and using those tools started to make us smart? We've been using tools, when I say we, it's a very loose definition of we, those guys down in the left corner, for 3 million years. And to make another essential point, without technology, none of us would exist. That is, the carrying capacity of the world for human beings is many, many orders of magnitude higher than it would be if we didn't have tools. In fact, if we were really forced to exist without any tools at all, it's not clear people could exist at all. There might be a few really idealized environments where we could get by, but the population would be extremely small, if not zero. So that's just to underpin how essential this is to understand the world, and it's even more essential now than it was 3 million years ago. So if you look at economic growth theory, it focuses, this is very much a central question. This goes back to the work of Solow, who showed that most of the story has to be in technological growth. But when you look at growth economics, there's been a lot of focus on a production function description of aggregate economies, and it's given us some useful insights, but I think we failed to really explain what's driving technological growth at this point. Now, in complexity economics, I think there's a shared vision in what Luciano is going to say and what this panel is about, that technology is an interacting and evolving ecology of stuff. And if we're going to understand technological growth, we better understand that interacting ecology of stuff. We need to know what that stuff actually is. And we've got to, as Nate Rosenberg famously said, we've got to get inside the black box and understand what actually drives technological progress. Now, in this talk, because the time's limited, I'm just going to give you 2 short examples to illustrate some of the ideas. And maybe if we get any time for questions, which would be wonderful, we can talk about some other things. But so I'm going to get, one is a prediction of progress of individual technologies based on empirical regularities. I wouldn't say there's any magical complexity stuff in here, since it's just sort of good old econometrics and statistics, but you'll see there's a twist that makes it a bit different. And then I'm going to go to something more ecological, where I do think we see complex systems ideas being more important. Now I want to begin with a motivation slide here that relates to some things that have been said so far. What I'm showing you here are the cost of 3 different technologies as a function of time. So on the lower left, you'll see a black squiggly curve, which is the price of coal, which I'm putting in units of how much that coal would contribute to the cost of electricity. So I can somewhat compare it to some other technologies. And what you see in this plot is that the price of coal fluctuates, but roughly speaking, it's been constant for about 150 years once you adjust for inflation. So you fit a time series model of that, you get a random walk without drift. We have a paper breaking down coal into its components, and our forecast for coal prices is, well, they're uncertain, but they're not going to change dramatically over the next 30 or 40 years. Might change by a factor of 2 or 3, but not much more than that. In contrast, you see in red there nuclear power prices, as evidenced by the cost for electricity of nuclear power plants as they came online in the United States. And what you see is over the 50 years or so that nuclear power has been a commercial product, the cost has gone up by about a factor of 3 in some noisy way. And then in contrast, we see solar energy, where we don't go all the way back to the beginning. The beginning of nuclear power and solar are about the same. These are photovoltaic solar prices, where they both came online in about 1955. And since then, solar energy has dropped in price by a factor of about 2,500. quite dramatically different. It's been going at 10% per year. And if you just make the extrapolation, you can see that it actually, by 2050, should be substantially cheaper than coal and substantially cheaper than nuclear power. Of course, there's uncertainty associated with that. And so is this believable? I mean, how do we know? It's not going to just turn around. And in fact, the work I'm going to tell you was motivated by, I remember about 8 years ago, we were at a meeting at the Santa Fe Institute, and Dan Schrag, when we talked about this fact that when you make more solar energy, the prices for solar energy come down, he said, well, how do you know coal isn't doing the same thing? And well, so we did the paper on coal just to demonstrate that it is actually quite different. Now, let me just say that in fact, rates at which prices drop for different products is very heterogeneous. We've made a little histogram here of information we've acquired by just wherever we could get it. And what you see is there's a central kind of normally distributed part where most technologies sit over there on the left. But then there are the outliers like DNA sequencing or computer hardware where you can get improvement rates of 80% per year for DNA sequencing, 40% per year for computer hardware, 10% per year for photovoltaics. Most things, more or less, when you adjust for inflation, aren't improving anymore. Now, the question is, what should you invest in? Well, on one hand, is this an inexorable process, or can we make a difference? And if so, what should that difference be, and which things make better investments? Now, there's two empirical regularities relating to technologies. One of them, Wright's law, has been around since 1936. Wright originally noticed it for aircraft manufacture, and he noticed that if you take a given kind of aircraft, prices tend to drop by about 20% every time you double the cumulative production of that kind of aircraft. Now, yet another regularity that's more recent is Moore's law that I think everybody's familiar with. In both cases, these began as very specific predictions, and they've now broadened out into much broader predictions about how the costs of many different and other factors of many different technologies behave. So for example, we can take Moore's law, and now we plot it for 4 different very diverse technologies: transistors, photovoltaics, hard disk drives, ethanol. We compare the data. So we're plotting on semi-log since the 1970s. Present, you compare the data to the exponential fit. And you can see in these 4 cases, it's not too bad. But actually, it turns out Wright's law works actually similarly well, if not even better, in all these cases. And so there's a big question of where do these regularities come from, and how can we use the regularities in order to make better forecasts, and how reliable are the forecasts that we can make with these regularities. So let me just say, I don't have time to go into this, and I'm watching the clock quite closely because I do want to end on time. But these turn out to be very closely related. You can actually show that if costs drop exponentially and production goes up exponentially, then you automatically get Wright's law. So note that, and by the way, I should have pointed this out, when I plotted Moore's law, we're plotting the log of the cost on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. When I show the plot for Wright's law, we're plotting the cost or the price on the log on the y-axis and the log of the cumulative production on the x-axis. So we're now talking about a power law rather than exponential, yet the fits come out similarly. It turns out if you have the 2 factors I said, exponentially decreasing costs and exponentially increasing production, you automatically get Wright's law. So there's a question of where's the cause and where's the effect with these laws. Now, tabling that question for a moment, let me just say that these laws can be used to make forecasts with reliable error bars. So that is, we can make a distributional forecast, and we can say what the different outcomes, how likely the outcomes are likely to be. And so the 2 papers I show up there are places where we've done this. I'll show you some results from the second paper where I'm now quite happy with the methodology. In both cases, this is based on experience for 50 different technologies. And the way we test this is we say, well, let's go back in the past. Let's pretend we're in 1980, and let's ask, given the data we had so far, how well can we predict where the price would be in 1990 or 2000 or 2010? And so we test all these, and then we actually fit the same model in every case. It's always an exponential, but the parameters are different, both about how fast the price drops with time and how noisy the process is as it goes along. And we do some tricks and we collapse all the data onto one distribution, which then allows us to use all the data to test at once, as we can pool all the data. And therefore, I can use data on, let me think of a good example. I can use data on transistors to help me get a good forecast about what solar energy is going to do. And I just want to make the point that it's one thing to make a forecast. It's easy to make a forecast. It'll go up by 15% in 10 years. But if I don't tell you how accurate that forecast is, what I've done is essentially worthless. What you really need are error bars on the forecast to make them useful, because that could be a very accurate forecast, in which case it's very useful, or an extremely noisy forecast, in which case it's not very useful. And without going to the details, and I'm worried about the time, this is our forecast for solar photovoltaics. So you can see there we are in the present. You can see the historical data that we've used. You can see plotted in the different colored bands the probabilities measured in standard deviations that we attach to the different outcomes. So we can say that, yes, it's quite likely that by 2030, the cost of solar photovoltaics are going to drop pretty dramatically and be cheaper than coal. But there is actually some probability, about 5% as it turns out, that they might stall and not go down anymore. Now, this is a very crude forecast based on the experience with many different technologies, because in other technologies we have seen things turn around before. And by the way, I just want to show you, that there's this question of people, the skeptics say, well, but solar photovoltaics can't ramp up fast enough. But if you just look at the rate at which different technologies have been generating electricity and extrapolate it, that's solar photovoltaics in green, you see that actually we predict to capture 20% of primary energy, which is, I think, about as far as you can imagine going, and having a forecast like this remain valid, because once solar starts to be a major player, intermittency kicks in. But we forecast we should hit in 2027. And in contrast, the IEA projects, and this is a revised, more optimistic forecast, only 16% of electricity by 2050. Now, where they get that forecast is beyond me, because I don't think the data suggests that at all, and they've consistently been way off in the same direction. So let me just say that we're working on doing something similar for Wright's Law. It's a critical thing to do because it has important policy implications. We do believe that we can show that increasing production, as, say, the Germans have done, does stimulate costs to come down. People like Nordhaus have said, well, the opposite. How do you know that costs coming down don't stimulate demand? But we've been studying World War II data where we have a great natural experiment, because we know that Roosevelt didn't say, gee, tanks are getting cheap, let's buy more, let's build more of them. In fact, in World War II, despite the fact there were very little market pressures for costs to drop, costs did drop as production came rocketing up. And if you want to make an investment, it's much better to make an investment in one of the technologies that's rapidly improving and has the potential for improvement than one that won't do that. Now, I want to quickly move on to talk about the second part, which is how we can use ideas from ecology to make predictions about economic growth. It's a little bit related to what Luciano's talk. And, generalized ecosystems exist in many different areas. We are making use and building on the formalism that was developed by Leontief, a remarkable visionary in my view, who has the input-output model of the economy, which is very much an ecological model, actually precisely analogous to equilibrium chemical kinetics based on conservation laws, and still used in national accounting and was used for central planning. Now, we're using that as the starting point for an evolutionary theory for economic growth. And to see the core idea that I want to present to you now, imagine the two economies I'm showing you here. So I'm plotting the networks. We have the final sector, the households, and we have two industries, S1 and S2. And in one case, we have a flat economy that both just produce final goods. And in the other case, we have a chain economy where industry S1 produces only an intermediate good for industry S2, and then industry S2 produces the final good. Both of them use labor. Now, what we can show is that if each of those industries grows at the same local rate, that is, absent the other industry, they would make progress in dropping their costs at a certain rate, the flat economy will grow at precisely that rate. Its trophic depth is 1, means if there's an improvement rate of a given gamma, it will just improve at rate gamma. But in the chain economy, because any improvements in S1 get past industry S2, and it then in turn adds on its improvements, so you get a multiplicative amplification. So if each improves at rate gamma in industry, in the chain economy, things will improve at rate L bar gamma, and L bar is a number greater than 1 because of the network structure of the economy. Now, so to make this more precise, we assume a simple local process for technological improvement. We show how this improvement's amplified as it propagates through the economy. We do some math using standard kind of network stuff, some of which would be very familiar already to growth economists. But our prediction is that all else equal, growth rates, economic growth rates, should depend on this aggregate output multiplier, which I'm going to call trophic depth in analogy with ecology. In ecology, they call it that because it has to do with the depth of the food chain. How many layers are there from the animals that bring the energy into the ecosystem, the plants that fix light from the sun, to the things, the herbivores that eat them, the carnivores that eat them, et cetera. So that's the trophic depth of the food chain. A similar idea applies in economics. And here, in fact, I show you a trophic picture of the economies of the US on the right and China on the left. So you can see the various industries in the economy. We plot the trophic depth, L for Leontief, on the y-axis, and we just lay out the industries according to their classification scheme along the x-axis. And you can see these economies look very different. First of all, the Chinese economy is much deeper now than the US economy. It has a trophic depth of the highest industry of almost 5.5, and the overall trophic depth of the economy is around 5. In contrast, for the US, the trophic depth's around 2.5, and there's very different industries that are emphasized in the US. In the US, you have industries like finance and several service industries that are the most dominant industries, in contrast to China, where manufacturing tends to dominate. Now, so this is the punchline slide. If we just plot the trophic depth on the x-axis against the growth rate of GDP per capita on the y-axis, we get an R-squared of about 0.45 with a p-value of 10 to the minus 6. And so we actually make quite a good prediction. I mean, it's not a fantastic prediction, but you have to realize that growth economics is a field where nothing predicts things very well. We've tested this against several standard growth models with varying numbers of factors. It takes 7 different factors in a fairly small data set, so you have a huge in-sample bias, to get an R-squared equal to the one we get with just one factor, the trophic depth. And furthermore, if we include that factor along with these other factors, it's always by far the most statistically significant variable and captures most of the p-value. Now, our work also suggests something about the developmental path that connects a bit up with what Luciano was said. Undeveloped countries have low trophic depth and low growth rates, and in many cases seem to be stuck. Developing countries have high trophic depth and high growth rates, and developed countries have low trophic depth and low growth rates. So they're back, actually in many respects, similar in this regard to undeveloped countries. And so this is a picture illustrating this. You see, I don't have a pointer, but there's a cluster of developed countries up in the upper left corner, the developing countries on the right towards the bottom, and some of the less developed countries down in the other corner. And here we're trying to back out the path of the US of trophic depth and GDP through time. I should say this gets less certain as you go back, but you can see the US started somewhere with a relatively low trophic depth in 1790, gets a very uncertain number, climbs until about 1900, and then slowly the trophic depth goes back down as we began to outsource our manufacturing economy to the rest of the world. So I want to close, and I think I'm actually ending on time, by saying that To explain economic growth, we need to understand technologies and their networked interactions with each other. Technological progress does have substantial predictable components, but we need a more fundamental understanding, and that growth is an evolutionary process, and biological analogies are very useful. And just to close, this morning, Angel Gurria said that complexity economics has a tendency to raise more questions than answers. Well, I think we have to get answers too. I think we are seeing some answers being produced in this meeting, and I think that's important. I think it is important that we also try to make predictions. Ralph and I have had a long-standing debate on this point, but if you want to say something about policy, you have to be able to make a prediction of some kind. You have to be able to say, if we're going to enact policy A, this is how the world will change. That's a prediction. Versus policy B, the world will change in this other way. And so we are forced to make predictions, and we have to try and refine those and develop our skill in this going forward. Thank you.
But please thank our panelists.